Okay, so diving right in, we've been really looking forward to unpacking this book, The Courage to be Disliked.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one.
You sent this over, and we thought this could be a really fun deep dive just to sort of understand some of these core concepts.
Yeah, I mean, there's some pretty radical ideas in here, but also some really practical stuff, I think.
Absolutely. And the thing is one of those books that's really taken off in the self-help world, personal growth, all of that.
It definitely seems to have struck a nerve with a lot of people.
Yeah. So we figured let's break down what makes it so compelling. What are some of the most interesting takeaways?
Yeah, because it's not just about feeling good. There's some deep psychological stuff going on here, too.
Right. So our mission, I guess you could say, is to sort of distill these core ideas that are going to make you go, oh, wow, I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe challenge some of those conventional assumptions we have about happiness, success, all of that.
Totally. And the thing is, I think a lot of these ideas, they might feel counterintuitive at first, but when you really sit with them, they start to make a lot of sense.
Oh, yeah, definitely. You have to be willing to sort of lean into the discomfort a bit because some of this stuff really goes against the grain of what we're used to hearing.
Exactly. So to give everyone a bit of a roadmap, we're going to explore this idea of denying trauma, which is a big one right off the bat.
That's right. And that's really tied into this concept of teleology, which is all about focusing on present goals rather than past causes.
Right. So instead of getting bogged down in why did this happen, it's more about what am I aiming for now,
Mm-hmm.
which is a really interesting shift.
It is. And then we're going to delve into this idea that all problems are fundamentally interpersonal relationship problems, which sounds pretty intense, but it's actually really insightful.
It is, yeah. And we'll
Yeah.
talk about how to separate tasks, which is this idea, figuring out whose responsibility is whose.
Yeah, because that can get really messy, especially in close relationships.
Absolutely. And then we'll touch on feelings of inferiority, which I think everyone can relate to on some level.
Oh, for sure. And how those feelings are often subjective, not based on some objective truth about ourselves.
Right. It's all about comparison and perception and how we interpret those things.
Exactly. And then we'll get into this idea of rejecting the desire for recognition, which might sound a little strange.
It does, because we're often taught that we need validation from others, right?
Totally. But Adlerian psychology takes a different stance on that, suggesting it can actually hold us back in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one to unpack. And then, of course, we have to talk about community feeling, which is this idea of belonging and contributing to something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, that's a central theme throughout the book, how important it is to see ourselves as part of a larger social fabric.
Right. And we'll look at horizontal relationships, which are built on equality and mutual respect, and how encouragement plays a key role in those.
Which is really different from praise, which Adlerians are pretty critical of.
Yeah, that surprised me too when I first read about it. But when you really look at it, praise can have some unintended consequences.
Definitely. And then finally, we'll wrap up by exploring how Adlerian psychology defines meaning and happiness.
Which, spoiler alert, has a lot to do with that sense of contribution and living in the here and now.
Exactly. So there's a lot to cover, but I think it'll be a really engaging conversation.
Absolutely. Okay, let's jump right into this first big concept, denying trauma. The book starts off with this dialogue between a philosopher and a youth, and they kind of get right to the heart of the matter.
Yeah, they go straight for the jugular.
And that's this idea that, according to Adlerian psychology, trauma from the past doesn't necessarily dictate your present.
And that's a pretty controversial statement, right? I mean, we hear so much about how childhood experiences shape who we become.
Exactly. But Adlerians, they don't deny the reality of painful experiences, of course.
No, of course not. It's not about dismissing or minimizing those things at all.
Right. But they're saying that we're not necessarily prisoners of our past, that those experiences don't have to define us.
It's like they're challenging that whole deterministic view where you're basically stuck with the hand you're dealt.
Yeah, like you're just a product of your circumstances. And Adlerian psychology says, no, you have more agency than that.
You have the power to choose how you respond to those experiences, how you interpret them, and ultimately, how you move forward.
Which is a really empowering message, I think.
It is. Because if you believe that your past completely determines your present and your future, then what's the point of even trying to change?
Right. You kind of feel hopeless. But Adlerian psychology is saying, no, you have more control than that. You're not just a victim of your past.
And that shift in perspective from feeling like a victim to feeling like you have agency, that's a really big deal.
Absolutely. It
Right.
can change your whole outlook on life. And this leads directly into this concept of teleology, which is a big one in Adlerian psychology.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. So teleology, it's basically about focusing on goals rather than causes.
Right. So instead of looking back and try to figure out why something happened, you're looking forward and asking, what am I trying to achieve?
Exactly. The book gives this really helpful example of a guy who's been holed up in his room for years, hasn't gone outside at all.
Oh, wow. That's pretty extreme.
It is. And you might think, well, something really traumatic must have happened to make him like that.
Right. Like
Oh.
maybe he's afraid of the outside world for some reason.
Yeah, that's the typical way of looking at it. But Adlerian psychology would say, no, he's actually choosing to stay in his room.
And the anxiety he feels, that's not the cause of his behavior. It's actually a tool he's using to achieve his goal of staying inside.
So the anxiety becomes a way to justify not going out, in a sense.
It's like, oh, I'm so anxious, I can't possibly leave the house. But the anxiety itself might be serving a purpose, which is to keep him in his comfort zone.
Exactly. And that's a really subtle but profound difference in perspective.
It is. Because it means that even though he might feel trapped by his anxiety, he actually has the power to choose differently.
And that's where that sense of agency comes in again. It's not that the anxiety isn't real, but it's being used as a means to an end.
Right. And Adlerians would say this applies to all sorts of emotions, not just anxiety. Like anger, for example.
Oh, absolutely. Anger is a big one. We often think of it as this uncontrollable force that just takes over us.
Yeah, like you just snap and you can't help it.
Right. But Adlerian psychology proposes that we actually choose to become angry.
Wow, that's a bit of a mind bender.
It is. But when you think about it, anger often serves a purpose, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
Like maybe it's a way to assert yourself, to get what you want, or to intimidate someone.
Exactly. The book gives this example of a mother yelling at her daughter. And it's easy to see that as the mother just losing control of her emotions.
Yeah, like she's just so overwhelmed with rage that she explodes.
But the Adlerian perspective is that she's using that anger strategically to get her daughter to listen, to assert her authority.
So the anger is a tool. It's a way to achieve a specific goal.
Right. And it might not be the healthiest or most effective way, but it's a choice nonetheless.
And that's a really different way of looking at emotions, right? Instead of seeing them as these passive things that just happen to us, we're actually choosing them in a sense.
Exactly. We're using them to achieve certain aims in our interactions with others.
Which brings us to this next big idea, that all problems are interpersonal relationship problems.
Yeah, that's a pretty sweeping statement, right?
It is, but when you start to think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense.
It does, yeah. Because we're social creatures at our core, right? We live in relationship to others.
Our sense of self is shaped by those relationships, the way we interact with other people, the way they perceive us.
And even our problems, the things we struggle with, they often stem from those interactions.
Think about it like conflicts at work, arguments with family members, feeling lonely or isolated.
It all boils down to how we're relating to others, whether consciously or unconsciously.
And that's where these feelings of inferiority come in, which the book talks about a lot.
Yeah, feelings of inferiority are a big part of Adlerian psychology. And the key point here is that these feelings are subjective.
Right, it's not about some objective deficiency that you have.
It's not like you're actually less than someone else in some measurable way.
It's more about how you perceive yourself in relation to others.
The philosopher in the book uses his height as an example. He's 61 inches tall.
Okay, so a little on the shorter side.
Yeah, but he says there's nothing inherently inferior about that height.
Right, it's just a number.
It only becomes a source of inferiority when he compares himself to taller people and decides that being shorter is somehow bad.
So it's the comparison that creates the feeling of inferiority.
Exactly. It's not the fact itself, but the interpretation of that fact in relation to others.
That's a really important distinction, I think.
It is. And then the book talks about the inferiority complex, which is when those feelings of inferiority become so overwhelming that they start to hold you back in life.
It's like you use those feelings as an excuse not to try, not to put yourself out there.
Like, oh, I'm not smart enough to go for that promotion, or I'm not attractive enough to ask that person out.
So the feeling of inferiority becomes this self-imposed limitation.
It does. And then there's the superiority complex, which is kind of the flip side of the coin.
That's when people try to mask their feelings of inferiority by acting superior to others.
Exactly. They might boast about their accomplishments, put others down, or try to draw attention to themselves.
It's like they're overcompensating for that underlying feeling of inadequacy.
And this is where Adlerian psychology offers a really important perspective. Life isn't a competition.
Yeah, that's something we often forget, especially in today's world.
It's so easy to get caught up in comparing ourselves to others, trying to be better than everyone else.
For Adlerian psychology says, no, the goal isn't to be superior to anyone else.
The pursuit of superiority, in the healthy sense, is about striving to be better than you were yesterday, about reaching your own full potential.
It's not about winning or losing, it's about personal growth.
Exactly. And that's a much more sustainable and fulfilling way to live, I think.
It is, because when you're constantly comparing yourself to others, you're never truly content with who you are.
Right. There's always someone else out there who's doing better, achieving more.
But when you focus on your own journey, on your own progress, you can find a deeper sense of satisfaction.
And that's what Adlerian psychology is all about, helping people to live more fulfilling and meaningful lives.
Okay, so we've talked about denying trauma, teleology, and the idea that all problems are ultimately about relationships.
And how important it is to recognize those feelings of inferiority and not let them hold us back.
Now let's move on to this concept of discarding other people's tasks, which is all about separating your responsibilities from the responsibilities of others.
Yeah, this is really important for building healthy boundaries and avoiding unnecessary stress.
It is. And it ties in with that idea of focusing on what you can control, which we talked about earlier.
Exactly, because you can't control other people's behavior, you can only control your own.
And trying to control other people, it's a recipe for frustration and resentment.
Oh, absolutely. And it often backfires because people don't like to feel like they're being controlled.
Right. It makes them defensive and rebellious.
The book uses this classic example of parents and their children.
Oh, yeah. That's a perfect example of where things can get messy.
It is. So Adlerian psychology would say that a child studying or not studying is ultimately the child's task.
Not the parent's task.
Exactly. The parent can provide support, encouragement, and a conducive environment.
But they can't force the child to study.
And trying to do so, it often creates more problems than it solves.
It can lead to power struggles, arguments, resentment.
And it also denies the child the opportunity to learn from their own mistakes.
Right, because if the parent is constantly hovering over them, making sure they do their homework, the child never really learns to take responsibility for their own learning.
Exactly. And that's a really important life lesson, to be able to own your choices and their consequences.
It is. And this concept of separating tasks, it applies to all sorts of relationships, not just parent-child.
Oh, absolutely. It's relevant in romantic relationships, friendships, work relationships, you name it.
Anytime you find yourself trying to control someone else's behavior, you're taking on their task.
And that's when you need to step back and ask yourself, is this really my responsibility?
Right. Because when you try to control things that are outside of your control, you're setting yourself up for disappointment.
And it's also a form of disrespect, because you're not allowing the other person to make their own choices.
Right. You're not giving them the autonomy to live their own life.
And that's a big part of what Adlerian psychology is all about, respecting the individuality of each person.
Okay, so separating tasks, respecting boundaries, it all ties into this idea of autonomy and personal responsibility.
It does. And it leads to another interesting concept, which is the denial of the desire for recognition.
So this is where Adlerian psychology gets a little bit controversial.
Yeah, this one might raise some eyebrows.
Because we're so conditioned to believe that we need validation from others, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're constantly seeking approval, praise, recognition.
From our parents, our teachers, our bosses, our friends, on social media.
And it's understandable, right? We
Yeah.
want to feel like we're good enough, like we're worthy of love and acceptance.
Right. But Adlerian psychology says that this constant seeking of recognition can actually be detrimental.
It can, because it makes you dependent on external validation.
So your sense of self-worth becomes tied to what other people think of you.
And that's a really shaky foundation to build your life on.
It is. Because you're always going to be at the mercy of other people's opinions.
And those opinions are going to change. They're not always going to be positive.
So you're constantly on this roller coaster of feeling good when you get praise and feeling bad when you get criticism.
And that's not a very sustainable way to live.
It's exhausting, right?
It is. And it can also prevent you from living authentically.
Because you're so worried about what other people will think, you might not do the things that you really want to do.
You might hold yourself back, play it safe, conform to expectations.
And that's where this idea of the courage to be disliked comes in.
Yeah, that's a really powerful concept.
It's the idea that true freedom comes from not fearing being disliked.
From being okay with the fact that not everyone is going to like you.
And that's okay.
It is. Because you can't please everyone all the time.
Then trying to do so, it's just going to make you miserable.
It is. And it's also going to prevent you from being your true self.
So the courage to be disliked, it's about living according to your own values and principles.
Even if that means facing disapproval from others.
It's about being authentic, even if it's not always popular.
Exactly. And that takes a lot of courage.
It does. Because we're so conditioned to seek approval, it can feel really scary to go against the grain.
But Adlerian psychology says that's the path to true freedom and happiness.
Because when you're not constantly seeking validation from others, you're free to be yourself.
And that's when you can truly connect with others in a meaningful way.
And that's where this idea of community feeling comes in.
Yeah, community feeling is all about seeing others as comrades, as fellow travelers on this journey of life.
It's about recognizing our interconnectedness, our shared humanity.
And it's about contributing to something bigger than ourselves.
The book talks about extending this feeling of community beyond our immediate circle of friends and family.
To the larger community, to society as a whole, even to future generations.
And that's where we find meaning and purpose, according to Adlerian psychology.
It's not about individual achievement, it's about contributing to the greater good.
And that's what brings true happiness.
Yeah, that's the ultimate goal, to live a life that is both meaningful and fulfilling.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We've talked about denying trauma, teleology, the importance of relationships, separating tasks, the desire for recognition, community feeling.
And the courage to be disliked.
And all of these concepts, they tie into this idea of horizontal relationships, which are based on equality and mutual respect.
Right, and these horizontal relationships, they're really different from vertical relationships, which are based on hierarchy and judgment.
And one of the key differences is how we encourage each other.
Adlerian psychology is pretty critical of praise.
Yeah, they see it as a form of judgment, even though it's often intended to be positive.
Because when you praise someone, you're essentially evaluating them according to your own standards.
And that creates a power dynamic where you're the one in charge and they're the one being judged.
The book gives this example of a mother praising her child for helping with dinner.
Saying, "You're such a good helper."
But she wouldn't say that to her husband if he did the same thing.
It's just assumed that the husband is capable of helping without needing praise.
But the child is still learning, so they need that external validation.
And that's the problem with praise. It can create dependence.
Because the child starts to believe that they only have worth when they're being praised.
And that can really undermine their self-esteem.
So instead of praise, Adlerian psychology encourages us to use encouragement.
Which is about expressing gratitude and appreciation without judgment.
So instead of saying, good job, you might say, thank you so much for your help. That was really helpful.
Exactly. You're acknowledging their contribution without evaluating them.
And that fosters a sense of equality and mutual respect.
And it also helps the other person to feel a sense of belonging and contribution.
Which brings us to this final concept, the Adlerian perspective on meaning and happiness.
So according to Adler, happiness is the feeling of contribution.
It's about knowing that you're making a difference in the world.
And that doesn't have to be some grand heroic act.
It can be something as simple as helping a friend, doing your job well, or just being kind to a stranger.
It's about using your unique talents and abilities to make the world a better place.
And that sense of contribution, it gives your life meaning and purpose.
It does. And it also brings happiness.
Because when you're contributing, you're living in alignment with your values.
You're doing something that matters to you.
And that's a really powerful feeling.
It is, and it leads to this idea of living in the here and now, what the book calls energia.
Which is about being fully present in each moment.
Not dwelling on the past or worrying about the future.
But just appreciating the beauty of the present moment.
And engaging with life fully.
Because that's where true happiness is found.
It's not some distant goal that we're striving for.
It's right here, right now, in this moment.
And that's a really empowering message, I think.
It is, because it means that happiness is accessible to everyone.
No matter your circumstances, no matter your past.
You can choose to find happiness in the present moment.
By connecting with others, by contributing to something bigger than yourself.
And by living authentically.
Exactly. So that's the essence of Adlerian psychology.
It's a really profound and life-changing philosophy.
I think so too. And it's one that I think everyone can benefit from exploring.
Absolutely. Okay, so to wrap things up, let's just recap some of the key takeaways from this deep dive into the courage to be disliked.
So we talked about how Adlerian psychology challenges this idea that we're defined by our past experiences, that trauma doesn't have to dictate our present or our future.
We explored this concept of teleology, which is about focusing on our present goals rather than dwelling on past causes.
And we talked about how all problems are ultimately interpersonal relationship problems stemming from the way we interact with and perceive others.
We also delved into the importance of separating tasks, of figuring out whose responsibility is whose, and respecting those boundaries.
And we touched on the idea of rejecting the desire for recognition, of finding our self-worth from within rather than seeking constant validation from others.
And then, of course, there's this crucial concept of community feeling, of seeing ourselves as part of a larger social fabric and contributing to something bigger than ourselves.
We talked about the importance of horizontal relationships based on equality and mutual respect, and how encouragement plays a vital role in those relationships.
And finally, we explored the Adlerian definition of happiness, which is the feeling of contribution, of knowing that you're making a difference in the world.
So there you have it, folks, a whirlwind tour of the core ideas of Adlerian psychology as presented in The Courage to be Disliked.
And we hope that this has given you some food for thought, some new perspectives to consider, and maybe even some inspiration to apply these ideas to your own life.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in learning more, we highly recommend checking out the book itself.
It's a really thought-provoking and engaging read.
And it's one that could potentially change your whole outlook on life.
Okay, so as we sign off, here's a final thought for you to ponder.
What if you really embrace this idea that your present is not determined by your past, but rather by the goals you're setting right now?
How would that shift your perspective? How would it change the way you approach your life, your relationships, your dreams?
We encourage you to sit with that question, to really explore it.
And to see where it leads you.
Because who knows, it might just unlock a whole new level of freedom and happiness for you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.
Take care.